She thought it was just another patrol through the sleepy forests of Willow Ridge. But when a trembling German Shepherd puppy with sorrow in his eyes stepped into her path and refused to leave her side, Officer Jenna Reed felt something shift. His paws were dirty, his ribs visible, yet his gaze held purpose. He wasn't just lost, he was leading her somewhere. What she discovered next would change all three of their lives forever. And if you've ever believed in the kind of love that can cross silence and pain, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, because this story will stay in your heart long after it ends. The morning sun filtered gently through the trees as Officer Jenna Reed adjusted her patrol belt and stepped onto the familiar trail that wound through the edge of Willow Ridge National Forest. Birds chirped overhead, the air carried the earthy scent of pine, and the gravel crunched softly beneath her boots. She often walked this old logging path at the start of her shift, a stretch of calm before the buzz of calls and traffic stops. Nothing much ever happened out here, just peace, trees, and the distant hum of a quiet town waking up. But something in her gut told her today would be different. About 15 minutes into her route, Jenna slowed. A strange prickle crept up the back of her neck. She turned. Nothing. The woods remained still. Shaking off the feeling, she pressed on until she heard it. A sound so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It was the delicate, almost hesitant rustle of something small stepping over fallen leaves. She paused, listened, then slowly turned again. There he was, a puppy, no more than 8 weeks old, stood in the center of the trail. His fur was dusty and slightly matted, his oversized ears twitching with uncertainty. He was barely the size of her forearm, with wide amber eyes that shimmered with something more than fear. A whimper escaped his throat, quiet, heartbreaking. Jenna crouched slowly, extending her hand. "Hey, buddy. Where'd you come from?" The pup tilted his head, one paw raised mid-step. But he didn't run. Instead, he shuffled forward, one hesitant paw at a time, as if measuring her soul with every movement. Then he stopped, just short of her fingers. Jenna stood slowly. The pup mirrored her, taking another tiny step, then another. She tested it, took a few slow strides down the path. The puppy followed. It wasn't random, it wasn't playful. This wasn't the aimless wandering of a lost dog. He was following her, guiding her. Jenna's brows furrowed. "What are you trying to tell me?" The woods seemed to shift around them, every sound sharper now. Birds quieted. A breeze stirred the branches above. Jenna turned off the main trail, letting instinct take over. The puppy didn't hesitate. He darted ahead, then paused, looking back to make sure she was keeping up. Through thickets, over roots and rocks, deeper into the untouched heart of the forest they went. And all the while, the little shepherd led the way with a strange, quiet urgency, his tail tucked, his legs trembling, but his heart unstoppable. Minutes passed. Jenna's breath quickened, not from fear, but anticipation. Whatever this pup was leading her toward, it mattered. She could feel it. Then he stopped. Beside a fallen cedar log, the puppy barked. Not a high-pitched yip, but a sharp, purposeful cry that startled a raven from the trees. Jenna rushed forward, ducking under branches, and then her breath caught. Lying in the shade beyond the log was another dog, full-grown, German Shepherd. Motionless. Jenna dropped to her knees, her training flaring to life. The older dog's fur was caked in dried blood and dirt. One hind leg was twisted at a sickening angle. Her side rose and fell barely. But it rose. She was alive. The puppy whimpered and pressed himself against her. His tiny body curled along her ribs, head nuzzled under her chin. It wasn't just another stray. This was his mother. Jenna felt her chest tighten. This little soul had walked. Who knew how far to find anyone who would listen? Who would come? She unclipped her radio, her voice shaking. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I've located 2 canines. One adult female in critical condition, one pup unharmed but clearly distressed, requesting immediate vet assistance and transport. The pup, as if hearing hope in her voice, finally collapsed against her side, eyes fluttering shut. Jenna rested her hand gently on his tiny back. He didn't flinch. He just breathed. And for the first time that morning, so did she. The mobile vet unit arrived with quiet urgency, its headlights weaving through the dense canopy as the tires rolled slowly over roots and pine needles. Jenna waved them down, her uniform streaked with mud and worry. The young techs moved swiftly, opening kits, laying out blankets. But before they touched the wounded shepherd, the puppy, now curled tightly against his mother, let out a trembling growl. His voice was soft but full of fear. Jenna placed her hand gently over his tiny shoulders. "It's okay, Scout," she whispered, naming him without thinking. "They're here to help her." The puppy didn't resist as she scooped him into her arms. His heart thudded against her chest, fast and frantic. Jenna held him close as the team examined the older dog. "We'll need to stabilize her before we move," one medic said. "She's holding on, but barely." Jenna nodded, her throat tight. She didn't even know the dog's name, but she could feel the weight of her presence, the quiet dignity beneath the pain, the strength that had carried her this far. She'd protected her pup long enough for him to find someone. That someone had been her. They called her Shadow, a name that fit the way her coat blended with the trees, the way she seemed to appear only when needed. Jenna rode with both dogs. In the van, Scout wrapped in a blanket on her lap. He didn't cry. He just kept his gaze fixed on the stretcher where his mother lay. The vet clinic in town was small, but staffed with people who cared. They whisked Shadow into surgery the moment they arrived. Broken bones, internal bleeding, the full scale of her injuries unfolding beneath fluorescent lights. Jenna stayed with Scout in the waiting room. He refused to leave the corner closest to the operating door, his ears twitching with every sound from behind it. Hours passed. Jenna didn't call in to resume patrol. She didn't think about the paperwork piling up on her desk. All that mattered was the little heartbeat pressed against her thigh and the silent battle happening behind a wall of steel and glass. When the vet finally emerged, her eyes looked tired but hopeful. "She's going to make it," she said. "It'll be a long recovery, but she's a fighter." Scout let out a small whine, almost like a sigh. Jenna didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until then. She exhaled, leaned back in the stiff plastic chair, and let herself smile for the first time in hours. The days that followed melted into a new kind of routine. Jenna visited the clinic every evening after her shift. Scout always greeted her with frantic tail wags and tiny jumps that barely lifted him off the ground. He'd leap into her arms and nuzzle under her chin, as if reassuring himself that she was real, that she was coming back. Shadow, though slow to heal, began to respond to her presence too. At first, she simply opened her eyes when Jenna entered the room, then her head lifted. Then a soft thump of her tail tapped against the floor. It was Scout who kept her alive in spirit. He refused to leave her side. Nurses laughed softly when he tried to curl himself over her bandaged leg, or when he brought her toys twice his size from the corner of the room. He ate only when she did, slept only when she seemed at peace. Jenna watched it all with something deeper than admiration. She saw a bond that ran beyond biology, a tether made from survival, loyalty, and the silent promise that neither of them would let the other go. One rainy evening, as thunder rumbled softly beyond the windows, Scout crawled into Jenna's lap. Shadow, still resting on her padded mat, turned her head and pressed her nose to Jenna's boot. That was the moment everything shifted. It wasn't just that these dogs had found safety. They had found her. And somewhere in the quiet between broken hearts and wagging tails, Jenna realized she didn't want to leave them behind when Shadow recovered. She wanted them home. The decision wasn't sudden. It had been growing inside her like ivy curling toward the light. But that night, she said it aloud. "I want to adopt them," she whispered to the vet on duty. The woman smiled. "I was wondering when you'd say that." The adoption papers were finalized in the quiet hum of the clinic's back office. Jenna signed her name with steady hands, though her heart thudded with a kind of nervous excitement she hadn't felt. In years, Scout sat under the desk, chewing gently on the corner of her bootlace, while Shadow rested in the sunlit corner of the recovery room. Her eyes half closed, her breathing calm. "This is the right choice," Jenna murmured, mostly to herself. "It always was," the vet replied. The next few days moved quickly. Jenna took time off from patrol, used her accumulated leave to prepare the small cabin she rarely visited, her grandfather's old place just outside town, nestled between tall spruce trees and a lazy river. It had sat empty for years, gathering dust and memories, but she'd never been able to part with it. Now it felt like it had been waiting for this moment. She cleaned, repaired the old fence out back, laid blankets near the fireplace, bought new dog bowls, food, toys. She found herself smiling at aisles she used to walk past. Squeaky balls and beef-flavored chews. A tiny red collar for Scout, and a sturdy harness for Shadow once her leg healed. With every item, the picture became clearer. This wasn't just a rescue dot, it was the beginning of something whole. The clinic staff gathered to say goodbye the morning Jenna brought them home. Scout bounced between legs and wagging tails while Shadow stood with quiet pride, her limp noticeable but not hindering her dignity. She didn't need a stretcher. She walked out beside her son. The ride to the cabin was peaceful. Scout stuck his head out the window, tongue flapping in the breeze, his eyes lit with joy. Shadow lay in the back seat, occasionally lifting her nose to sniff the fresh forest air. Jenna glanced at them through the mirror and felt something warm press behind her eyes. They belonged together. She didn't know how else to describe it. The cabin welcomed them like an old friend. The screen door creaked, the floorboards groaned, but the space felt alive in a way it never had when it was just hers. Scout tore through the grassy yard, chasing butterflies and barking at squirrels. Shadow stepped cautiously, exploring her new domain with careful steps and alert eyes. She paused beneath a tall birch tree and tilted her head to the sky, as if letting the peace of the place sink into her bones. That first night, Jenna lit a fire and sat on the old rug, back against the couch. Scout was already asleep, curled in a tight ball at her feet. Shadow lay nearby, head resting on her paws, eyes half-lidded but watching. "You're safe now," Jenna whispered. "Both of you." She didn't expect an answer, but when Shadow blinked slowly and Scout let out a soft sigh in his sleep, she felt it unspoken, but understood. The days past gently. Mornings began with dew on the grass and Scout yipping at the birds. Jenna sipped her coffee on the porch while Shadow kept a silent watch near the edge of the woods. Their wounds began to fade, not just the physical ones, but the ones that had carved deeper. Shadow gained strength. Scout gained confidence. And Jenna, without realizing it, began to soften in places she thought had gone numb. She no longer rushed. No longer filled her silences with noise or her downtime with distraction. She learned to sit, to listen, to let love arrive in wagging tails and quiet loyalty. One afternoon, she found Scout pawing at an old photo frame buried in a drawer. Her and her late father, both in uniform, standing outside the same cabin. She sat on the floor, Scout in her lap, and told him about the man who had taught her to serve and protect. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Scout's head against her chest said everything. Shadow lay across from them, watching, her tail thudding once against the floor. That night, Jenna dreamed of paths in the forest, of small paw prints leading her forward, always toward something she hadn't known she needed. When she woke, Scout was snuggled into the crook of her arm. Shadow lay just beyond, her breath steady, her eyes closed but peaceful. They weren't just dogs anymore. They were family. And for the first time in years, Jenna knew she wasn't alone. First storm came a week later. Not a violent one, just heavy summer rain sweeping through the trees, soaking the earth, turning the yard into a patchwork of puddles. But for Shadow, it might as well have been a battlefield. The moment the thunder rumbled in the distance, her body stiffened. Her ears flattened, her breaths shallow and sharp. Scout, confused, darted between her and the windows, unsure if it was a game or a threat. Jenna saw the change instantly. She knelt beside Shadow, moving slowly, not touching at first, just being there. The older shepherd stood in the middle of the living room, legs rigid, eyes distant, as if expecting something terrible to come crashing through the walls. Her tail was tucked, her muscles coiled. Jenna lowered her voice. "You're not alone anymore. You're safe here." Scout pawed gently at Shadow's leg, whining, not understanding. Jenna let him stay close but watched him carefully. He still bore the softness of a puppy, but there was something older in him too. Like he carried memories that didn't belong to his age. The storm rolled on. Jenna sat on the floor and waited. It took nearly 20 minutes for Shadow to lie down again. She didn't sleep that night, and neither did Jenna. But they sat together through every clap of thunder, every gust of wind, until morning light crept in and dried the wet world. The next day, Shadow walked a little slower. Scout stayed closer than usual, and Jenna made a note to talk to the local animal trauma specialist about therapy for rescued working dogs, because Shadow hadn't just survived something, she'd remembered something. Jenna's law enforcement contacts helped fill in some of the blanks. The tattoo inside Shadow's ear matched a batch of retired police. K9 South once registered to a now-defunct station across state lines, one that had closed abruptly after an internal investigation involving mishandled deployments. Records were incomplete. Some dogs were transferred. Others simply vanished from the system. Jenna sat in her cruiser, the printout resting on her lap, fists clenched. Shadow had likely been abandoned, written off, dumped in the woods to die. Scout was never meant to survive either. The thought made her sick. She folded the papers and didn't mention the details to either of them. What mattered now was that they were here, together, breathing the same forest air and sleeping under the same roof. That evening, she tossed a tennis ball across the clearing in the yard. Scout tore after it, tail wagging wildly, skidding in the damp grass. He brought it back 3 times before flopping over in a patch of clover, panting, his tongue lolling. Shadow sat a few feet away, watching. Jenna didn't push, but she gently tossed a second ball in her direction. It landed by her paw. Shadow blinked. And then, to Jenna's surprise, she picked it up, walked it slowly back, dropped it by Jenna's foot. Scout barked in delight, and just like that, something cracked open. The space between healing and living blurred. They weren't just recovering anymore. They were learning how to play. Jenna brought out more toys over the next few days. Scout loved anything that squeaked. Shadow preferred tug ropes and soft, silent games. They developed their own routines, Scout leaping into the creek for frogs, Shadow patrolling the perimeter, Jenna jogging alongside them as the sun rose and set through the canopy. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by. An elderly man who used to work with Jenna's grandfather. "Didn't think I'd see anyone breathe life back into this place." He chuckled, watching Scout chase butterflies. Jenna smiled, kneeling to rub Shadow's ears. "They rescued me as much as I rescued them." The man nodded solemnly. "Sometimes it's the broken ones that teach us how to be whole again." That night, as Jenna read by the fire, Scout curled into her side and Shadow stretched out at her feet. Snoring softly, Jenna felt it, that unmistakable, quiet warmth that only comes from being exactly where you're meant to be. She didn't need noise. She didn't need crowds. She had loyalty beside her, love at her feet, and hope curled under her arm. It was more than enough. The fall came early that year. By mid-September, Golden leaves littered the porch, and a crisp wind whispered through the pines. Scout had grown taller, legs longer but still clumsy, ears perked with curiosity at every new sound. Shadow's limp remained, but her movements carried strength now, like she'd reclaimed something once taken. Jenna watched them from the cabin window one morning as Scout pounced on a pile of leaves and Shadow watched. Bemused, tail swishing once in dry grass, she smiled. They had become her compass, but even peace carries shadows of the past. Jenna had begun volunteering with a local shelter visiting abused and abandoned dogs, brought in from surrounding counties. She'd walk the fearful ones, sit with those who couldn't yet be touched, whisper stories of a puppy named Scout who refused to give up, and a mother named Shadow who endured the unthinkable. Somehow, they listened. One day, she brought Scout with her. The shelter staff were hesitant. Puppies could be unpredictable, but the moment he padded into the room, his tail wagging and eyes gentle, the tension softened. He approached a trembling hound curled in the corner, lay down several feet away, and waited. Minutes passed. Then the hound crept forward, inch by inch, until their noses touched. Scout didn't move. He's like a therapy dog, one staffer said quietly. Jenna looked down at him. He's a survivor. That's what makes him safe. Word spread quickly. Soon, the shelter asked if she'd consider registering Scout for a trauma response training program, something formal, something real. He already had the heart for it. Now he could have the badge. She said yes. Shadow, though older and quieter, became part of the two. Not in training, but in presence. When Scout returned from sessions, amped with energy and new commands, he'd curl beside his mother and nudge her gently. She'd rest her chin over his back, listening with tired but proud eyes. They weren't just healing. They were helping others do the same. And Jenna found herself changing too. She stopped checking her phone obsessively, started cooking real meals again, played music in the evenings. Sometimes she'd catch herself laughing loud, free, the kind of laugh that didn't come with apology. It wasn't just because of the dogs, it was because of who she was around them. She felt seen, grounded, needed. Still, not everything was easy. Some nights, Shadow would wake suddenly, pacing the hallway, ears twitching. Jenna would find her by the door, tail low, eyes haunted. She'd open it, let her out, and follow barefoot into the yard. Scout would come too, quiet, alert. They would stand beneath the stars. 3 silhouettes in the dark, each one carrying scars. Jenna never asked what Shadow remembered in those moments. She just waited. Eventually, Shadow would return, nose bumping. Jenna's palm, tail lifting again. They always came back together. One afternoon, a group of school kids visited the shelter. Jenna brought Scout for a demonstration. The children sat cross-legged in the grass while Scout performed simple commands: sit, stay, touch, spin. Then Jenna told them this story. A tiny pup. A dark forest. A mother on the edge of death. A journey. He shouldn't have survived. One little girl raised her hand. Was he scared? Jenna knelt beside Scout and looked at him. Yes, she said softly. But he walked forward anyway. That's what made him brave. The children crowded around to pet him, their small hands careful and kind. Scout didn't flinch. He nuzzled into the group, tail wagging, eyes shining. Later, as they walked back to the truck, Jenna glanced at the old battered photo she kept tucked in her wallet, the one of her and her dad outside the cabin. You'd like him, she whispered. You'd like them both. That night, Scout curled beside her on the couch, his body warm against hers. Shadow rested on the rug, her head turned toward the door like always, watching, guarding, trusting. Jenna leaned back, heart full. Whatever storm still lingered, they would face them together. And in the silence of that fire-lit room, she finally understood. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing love anyway. Winter arrived quietly in Willow Ridge. The first snow fell overnight. layering the world in white silence. When Jenna opened the cabin door that morning, Scout bolted into the yard, kicking up powder with every joyful bound. His fur had filled out, his stride confident, his ears standing tall, no longer a frightened stray, but a sentinel of the woods. He once wandered through alone. Shadow followed more slowly, her steps careful but steady. Her limp remained, a ghost of the past etched into every motion. But her eyes were clear, her posture proud. She stepped onto the porch, lifted her nose to the sky, and closed her eyes as snowflakes danced around her face. Jenna leaned against the doorway, watching them. Her coffee steamed in her hands, but she hardly noticed the cold. These mornings had become her rhythm, her prayer. No alarms, no chaos, just breath and light and movement. They were her family now. She had filed the paperwork to become Scout's official therapy handler a few weeks earlier. He'd passed his tests effortlessly. It was as if he'd been born for it. Every child he sat beside, every survivor he comforted, every broken heart he nudged, he did it with a wisdom that couldn't be trained. People often asked how old he was. Jenna would smile and say, old enough to know better, young enough to keep going. Shadow never joined the public work, but she had her place too, waiting by the door when they returned, lying beside Scout at night, humming with a quiet strength that radiated through the house. Her job wasn't to fix others anymore. She had already done the impossible. One afternoon, as they returned from a long trail walk, Scout suddenly stopped. He stood at the edge of the clearing, ears perked toward the tree line. What is it? Jenna asked, pausing behind him. For a moment, she thought he might bolt some instinct triggering. But instead, he sat, still, watchful, and then she heard it. Not a sound exactly, just a feeling, the same feeling she'd had the day they first met, when a tiny puppy stepped onto her path and asked her to listen. She walked beside him and looked into the trees. Nothing stirred, no danger, no threat, just wind in the leaves and the memory of a moment that changed everything. Scout turned to her then, eyes soft. Jenna smiled and reached down, fingers brushing his head. I remember too, she said. That night, she pulled out the old notebook she kept by the fire. It wasn't for police reports anymore. It was filled with notes about healing, progress, ideas. She flipped to a blank page and wrote a single sentence. The dogs who survive can teach the rest of us how. She closed the cover and sat back. Scout snored softly beside her. Shadow stirred in her sleep, her paw twitching like she was running through dreams. The cabin was warm, lit only by firelight and memory. Jenna knew the story wasn't over. There would be more rescues, more fear, more moments in the dark when someone human or animal would need a guide. And Scout would be ready. Shadow too, in her own quiet way. But for tonight, they were simply together. 3 souls, 1 home, and more love than words could hold. Spring arrived like a whisper, soft rains, budding green, and the scent of renewal woven through the air. The snow melted into the earth, feeding the stream behind Jenna's cabin until it babbled louder each morning, as if even the land was learning to speak again. Jenna had changed, though she hardly noticed it at first. It wasn't dramatic. It was in the way she lingered by the porch longer in the mornings, how her laughter came easier now, how she no longer avoided mirrors or the stillness of her own thoughts. Scout had taught her that. Shadow had reminded her. One morning, she found Scout sitting at the window, staring out at the woods with his ears perked, his posture alert but not afraid. She followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Birds, wind, the soft sway of trees. Thinking about where you came from? She asked gently. He looked back at her, eyes calm, steady, then hopped down and pressed his head into her chest, tail wagging. Jenna wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "You brought me here too." Shadow stood nearby, watching with the kind of quiet only old souls understood. She had grown slower, more careful in her steps, but her gaze had lost none of its fire. The vet said her body might never fully recover, but that her heart already had. Dot and Jenna believed it. They made plans, the three of them. Not written or spoken, but lived. Jenna bought an old second-hand trailer and converted it into a mobile outreach van for Scouts therapy visits. With the help of local volunteers and a grant from the county's Community Initiative Fund, she painted the outside sky blue and stenciled a logo across the side, the Shadow Scout Project, silhouette of a shepherd pup standing in front of a larger dog, both facing forward. She didn't tell anyone how hard she cried after finishing the last brushstroke. The first visit took them to a foster care center 2 towns over. Scout wore a bright green vest with his name on the side. Shadow rode up front with Jenna, head out the window, catching the breeze like it carried all the ghosts away. Children waited on the steps, some shy, some excited, others unsure. Scout approached each one with the same tenderness he had once. Used to nudge his mother awake. No rush, no demands. Just presence. One girl, no older than 8, sat alone on the swing set. Arms crossed, face blank. Jenna let Scout approach her on his own. He sat a few feet away, didn't move, just waited. Minutes passed. Then the girl looked up. "Is he yours?" she asked. Jenna smiled from a distance. "No, I'm his." The girl stared, then slid off the swing and walked over. She knelt, placed her hand on Scout's back, and exhaled so deeply it shook her shoulders. "He's warm," she whispered. Jenna felt her throat tighten. That night, after the kids had gone inside and the van was packed up, Jenna sat on the steps of the center. Scout curled beside her. Shadow lay stretched out under the stars, her chin resting on her paws. A staff member brought her coffee and sat beside her. "You know," she said, "we've had therapists come through here for years. None of them reached that girl like your dogs did today." Jenna looked out into the darkness. "They understand what it means to be left behind and to be found again." When they returned home, Jenna stood in the doorway and looked at the cabin. It no longer felt like a place she was hiding in. It was a place she belonged to. A place that had grown with them. Scout brushed past her legs and bounded into the living room, tail wagging. Shadow followed slower, but with no less joy. The family was whole. The pain hadn't disappeared, but love had wrapped itself around it so completely. It didn't have the final word. The anniversary came without fanfare. Jenna only realized it had been a full year when she stumbled across the date on an old vet receipt while cleaning out a drawer. 1 year since that morning patrol. 1 year since Scout emerged from the woods, trembling and determined. 1 year since Shadow lay broken beneath a fallen tree, clinging to life by a thread of faith in her pup. She sat at the table and stared at the paper for a long time, her fingers trembling slightly. So much had changed. And yet, it all still felt like yesterday. Scout padded into the room with a worn-out rope in his mouth, tail wagging like a metronome. Shadow followed, her pace slow but dignified. Her silvered muzzle brushed Jenna's arm as if to say, "We're still here." Jenna smiled and knelt between them, burying her face into Scout's fur. He licked her cheek once, then plopped onto the floor, resting his head against her foot. Shadow laid beside him, shoulder to shoulder, just like she had in that forest. Clearing. Later that evening, Jenna took them both for a walk. No patrol, no mission. Just a walk. They followed the same trail she'd walked that day a year ago. The gravel crunched beneath their steps, birds sang overhead. Scout darted ahead with familiar joy, chasing butterflies and splashing through puddles. Shadow moved steadily beside Jenna, her step sure, her head held high. At one bend in the path, Jenna stopped. This was the spot, the exact place she had first heard the leaves rustle behind her, where a tiny life had asked her to follow. She crouched down, pressed her hand to the earth, and whispered, "Thank you." Scout returned to her side, head tilted, curious. "This is where you changed everything," she said. "You didn't just save your mother, you saved me." The wind picked up gently, rustling the trees like an answer. Scout leaned into her touch. Shadow stood close, her presence like a warm shadow against the light. When they returned to the cabin, Jenna lit a small fire in the yard. She sat between them, wrapped in a blanket. As the flames danced under the stars, she had never been a sentimental person, not before Scout, not before Shadow. But now she understood that some stories deserve to be remembered, not written in stone, but lived, repeated in quiet ways, like morning routines and late-night cuddles, like scars that didn't fade but no longer hurt. Inside, pinned above her desk, was a photo. Scout and Shadow curled together on the cabin floor, their bodies forming a crescent of trust and survival. Below it, Jenna had written 5 simple words on a torn scrap of paper. They never gave up. Ever. The Shadow Scout project continued to grow. More shelters, more visits, more children who found their first sense of safety beside a shepherd's steady gaze. Jenna trained other officers in trauma-informed canine rescue work. She gave talks, but she always came home. Home was this cabin, this porch, these paws beside her boots. And as seasons came and went, as Scout matured and Shadow aged with grace, cabin remained full of life, of belonging. One morning, Scout pressed his nose to Jenna's arm while she made coffee. He looked up with the same expression he'd had that first day, half hope, half question. "What is it, bud?" she asked. He barked once and walked to the door. Jenna opened it and followed him outside. He didn't go far, just to the yard's edge where wildflowers bloomed beside the tree line. Shadow joined a moment later, sitting beside Scout, and there they stayed, watching the woods, not out of fear, but out of reverence, because it all began here, in these trees. With pain, yes, but also with love. Jenna stepped between them and rested a hand on each of their backs. "We're home," she whispered, not because they had found a place, but because they had found each other. And sometimes, that's all it takes to rewrite a life.